Everyone knows the Western. It is a tried and true genre of American literature and film. The Western has as distinct an identity as any other genre in modern media, because everyone knows the iconography. The horse, the revolver, the strong, grizzled, unfeeling, and yet sensitive man in a hat. If you see these things, you know what you're in for. There's going to be gunfighting, there's going to be bandoleros, there's going to be trotting down the muddy main road. These tropes were established in the early 1900s by Western dime novels, novels that turned the life of the outlaw into a spectacle of hard men and harder times. The men in these stories lived on the edge of society and fought the law to maintain their freedom and way of life. At least that's what the stories want you to think. A notable book, The Virginian by Owen Wister, is widely regarded as the first real Western, and it set many of the tropes that we see today in motion. They're solidified then by the iconic Western movies of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. With a new medium, film, came a new way to tell these stories, and thus a new way to change and make concrete the tropes of a genre. Western films starring paragons of truth and morality, John Wayne and Clint Eastwood, became the standard. The funny thing is, though, the Western's popularity has declined significantly since the middle of the 20th century, and now here in 2025, the thought of a Western movie being the most significant thing in Hollywood is kind of laughable. Sure, there's stuff like Django Unchained, but that's a Tarantino movie. They can still draw money, but not the way they used to. No, now the piece of Western media that draws the most critics, the most money, the most attention, that's Red Dead Redemption. Despite being released 6 years ago, Red Dead Redemption 2 is still the current champion when it comes to Westerns today. This has a lot to do with Red Dead Redemption 2 being a video game, and video games being the new frontier, so to speak, of entertainment and media. One could argue, and I would, that the reason a Western works so much better as a video game is because you get to actually be the gunslinger. Westerns are, and have always been, undeniably male power fantasies, and now you get to actually control the fantasy rather than just watching it happen. More importantly, though, as genres change and creators make new media, which relies on the tropes associated with those genres, they say new things about them. So what does Red Dead Redemption 2 have to say about Westerns? Let's start with some history. If you're going to start with books, you have to start with The Virginian by Owen Wister. This one's about a ranch hand who, through hard work and determination, goes on to become a land-owning farmer by the end of the narrative. It's very up-by-your-bootstraps Americanism. It's kind of like if John Marston had a happy ending. By the 50s, we arrive at a writer like Louis L'Amour, whose work is exemplified by a book called Hondo. The Virginian may come first, but the classic lone-wandering, revolver-twirling, badass gunslinger, he's fully completed by the work of Louis L'Amour. By the end of the same decade, though, a book called Warlock by Oakley Hall takes a very different approach. In this book, we see the classic cops and robbers setup, or if you want to be way more problematic, cowboys and Indians, where the lawmen take on the outlaws in several gunfight scenes, even though a lot of those scenes happen off-page, which is weird, but the book, though, is centralized around a pretty significant critique of capitalism, where the good guys go up against the landowners who own the mine and exploit the townspeople who work in it. And finally, there is a book like Blood Meridian in the 80s, which is more about the dark and destructive elements of the spectacularized Wild West. If Westerns are about the glorious gunfighter, Blood Meridian wants you to know what happens when bullets actually hit people. It's rough, it's rugged, and it's actually kind of horrible to read at times, and yet it's a new take with a new decade. Western films, on the other hand, grew up alongside Western literature. In fact, one of the first films ever made was a Western, a silent film in 1903 called The Great Train Robbery. But just like with literary Westerns, you have to fast forward to the 50s to see the Western at its peak. And if you're talking about Westerns in the 50s, you're talking about this asshole. Whether we like it or not, it is John Wayne's performances during the golden era of Westerns that solidifies him as one of the most significant figures in American history, and the Western as the archetypal American genre. No other place can have Westerns. It is in America. That's how it becomes Americana. So from Stagecoach to Hondo to The Searchers to True Grit, they all show John Wayne being a badass gunslinger who follows his own moral code and, of course, shoots people with revolvers. And those people, I just want to note, are often white guys with brown face paint on pretending to be indigenous. Not a good look. Also, I don't think I can make a video about westerns and not mention the importance of Clint Eastwood. In movies like The Outlaw Josie Wales, Eastwood hits the same exact beats of being a mean-talking, hard-hitting, gun-shooting male power fantasy. It isn't until much later that we get more wacky stuff like Cowboys vs. Aliens, which has science fiction elements, Bone Tomahawk, which has horror elements, and then, of course, the Tarantino's Django Unchained, which I don't have to say anything more about that. With all that said, in 2025, westerns do not have the same cultural relevance they once did. They used to be the most important movies in Hollywood for decades, kind of like how the superhero film is right now. In that time, between then and now, a new medium has emerged: video games. And being the cultural force and entertainment that they are, video games push forward genres like science fiction, historical fiction, fantasy, and of course, the western. So here's the question. If genres change over time and new mediums emerge that change those genres, what does Red Dead Redemption have to say about the western? I think it has many things to say about the western. I think it wants to complicate westerns, especially the second game. The second game, the first one too, but these games can range from super silly to deathly serious.
Let's get you out of here. Oh, yes. Indeed, son.
In seconds. And this range captures all of the nuance and ridiculousness of the western throughout its century of existence. But one theme of the western that is present in a majority of them is legacy. Becoming a legendary outlaw, a legendary gunslinger, a legendary lawman, or protecting or redeeming that legacy in some way is often at the heart of why two men meet in the middle of the town at noon and draw on each other. It is through this theme that I think we can best see the way Red Dead Redemption 2 makes a statement about the western genre itself. So, here goes nothing. Throughout the game, the player can participate in side missions called tasks, as well as the main story. And in a side mission called The Noblest of Men and a Woman, Arthur meets a man called Theodore Levin, who is trying, kind of unsuccessfully, to write a biography about a gunslinger named Jim Boy Calloway. Boy Calloway is, put simply, a drunk and a fraud. He is not the gunslinger that Levin believes he is. Actually, that's not quite right. Levin knows that Calloway is a fraud, but Levin also knows that a book about one of the last famous gunslingers is going to sell a lot of copies, and so Levin is determined to take that story to the bank. The problem is, he needs quotes that corroborate that story. This is where the player, Arthur, steps in to fill in the gaps. The author tasks Arthur with tracking down 4 old gunslingers that Calloway apparently knew: Emmett Granger, Billy Midnight, Flaco Hernandez, and of course, Black Bell. These gunslingers represent a subversion of the gunslinger that we know today, each in a different way. When we think of the gunslinger, we think of John Wayne. We don't think of a scrawny old man, a wimp on a train, we don't think of a Mexican gangster, and we certainly do not think of a woman. So let's break each of them down. When Arthur meets Emmett Granger, the man is working on a small pig farm that he was granted by the federal government in exchange for his freedom. He is old and dirty looking, with his belly hanging out of his barely buttoned shirt. He's missing teeth. He's got a horseshoe haircut. It is not a good look. Not only this, but Granger starts chirping at Arthur the second you ride up to him. And his attitude is pretty foul the entire time you're with him. Granger agrees to give Arthur a quote about Calloway on the condition that Arthur shovels the pig shit for him. While Arthur's doing this, Granger carries on and on about how tough he was. I've killed this, that, and the other thing. I used to skin people alive and bury them. Stuff like that. At one point he says,
I killed men, women, and children too. Animals. I even killed rocks. And I killed them good.
right. Anyway, eventually Arthur gets annoyed and presses Granger to give him a quote about Calloway.
This is your last chance, Mr. Granger. Give me a quote for the book.
Hey, you don't hit no man of peace, no government witness.
Calloway said you was full of piss.
Granger starts to yell about how the book should be written about him, not that fraud Calloway. And in response, Arthur takes a stick of dynamite, shoves it in the pile of pig shit, and that results in Granger being covered in fecal matter after it explodes. Granger becomes enraged, and he challenges Arthur to a duel, and Arthur kills him. The idea of legacy is clearly here. Granger is angry that the book is going to be about someone who does not, in his view, have the esteemed legacy that he does. He was an actual killer, a ruthless one, if he's to be believed. I mean, he even killed rocks.
I even killed rocks.
While Granger may believe he deserves more praise for his time as a gunslinger, the reality is very different. Emmett Granger is an old man who's been relegated to pig farming after cutting a deal with the federal government. He does not go out in a blaze of glory, nor does he get to ride away into the sunset atop a beautiful horse. He dies covered in shit, shot to death by Arthur Morgan. His legacy is that he turned snitch, lived in obscurity on a small pig ranch, and died like a nobody. Granger's story is far more Blood Meridian than it is Virginian. And I think the point of Granger's story is to be much more in line with reality than with the overly spectacularized westerns that we're used to today. The legacy of the most ruthless killers and gunslingers of the frontier might be just that. Unremarkable and unremembered. Dead. Covered in shit. Arthur walks into a train station and asks about Billy Midnight, one of the gunslingers on his list. The postman says, "That old soak." I can't do the voice.
Oh, that old soak?
You'll catch him riding on the trains. That's all he does. Arthur boards the train and begins his search. You find Midnight, as the postman suggested, in the bar car, standing at the bar, waiting to be served another. When Arthur approaches him, he turns his back to him. He doesn't want to talk about all his days as a gunfighter. Like with Granger, Arthur presses Midnight for a quote about Calloway, and Midnight loses it. He screams, "I didn't shoot him in his sleep," and takes off running.
I didn't shoot him in his sleep.
No one's
I didn't shoot
saying
him in
that.
his sleep, and if I did, it was the only way.
Not a problem. I'm here about Jim Boy Calloway, and no one shot him yet.
I knew you'd come for me. Get away from me!
Midnight. Midnight, a paranoid man who is so afraid of being caught that he runs at even the slightest mention of his days as a gunslinger, once again highlights legacy. This is not a John Wayne. In fact, Midnight doesn't look anything like a classic gunslinger should, according to the iconography we all know now. He's wearing a bow tie, or a nice tie, and a fancy jacket, for God's sake. His look actually furthers what this entire storyline in the game is trying to get at. The gunslingers we're used to seeing, John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, even Arthur Morgan, they're made up. They're fiction. The truth about the gunslingers is that the ones we think of when we think of the Wild West might be bullshit. This guy might be what they actually look like. This has to do with legacy, sure, but it has to do with the bigger American story as well. To make matters worse about Midnight, once Arthur disarms Midnight by shooting a gun out of his hand, he takes out another gun and tries to kill himself. In my version, I just shot him before he could do that. Or actually, I tried to shoot the gun out of his hand, but it didn't really work. So again, Midnight dresses like some old-timey businessman. He runs at the very thought of having to fight someone who knows about his past, and he takes his own life if Arthur doesn't do it for him. This is not what gunslingers are supposed to do. Gunslingers are tough and gritty and fight even when they know the odds are against them. They are not caught unaware. They don't run away from confrontation. That's what the gunslingers in pop culture don't do. In real life, we don't really know. But the reality is that the frontier was a pretty tough time to live, and if it came between you and another person, shooting them in their sleep may not be the worst decision. Granger was a washed-up old man, so in love with his own legacy that he wasn't able to say anything of substance about Calloway. This wouldn't have been a problem, but when Arthur questions his legacy, Granger forces him to a duel, and Arthur kills him.
I even killed rocks.
Midnight runs from any mention of his legacy and yells about something that Arthur didn't even know about. For Midnight, legacy is something that he's trying to escape, not something John Wayne, our glorious American hero, would ever do. I just want to say, in The Searchers, John Wayne plays a Confederate, and there's a scene where there's a guy that says something about renouncing the Confederacy, and John Wayne's like, I would never do that, because it's about, like, sticking to your guns and not backing down from a fight. So both these men, Granger and Midnight, they highlight the ways in which legacy becomes something that indirectly kills you, not something that is worth remembering or fighting over. And yet, these gunslingers will, as far as we know as the player, not be written about. The great deeds Granger claims to have done, killing rocks, they die with him. And whether Midnight actually did kill that guy in his sleep, it's inconsequential. Calloway is the only one who will be enshrined into legend via Levine's book. And the only constant about him is that none of the people that Arthur tracks down seem to think that he's worthy of that honor. Of the 4 gunslingers of Calloway's past, Flaco Hernandez is the only one who lives up to the standard that we think of today when we think of a Western outlaw. Unfortunately, his reaction to Arthur not only makes the least sense, but is the least interesting. This is a shame, because he has the potential to be the most interesting, behind Black Belle, of course. Let's not get crazy. To get to Hernandez, Arthur has to trek back into the mountains where you start the game. Once you get to Hernandez's camp, you're greeted by his goons, who will accost you and essentially tell you to get lost. I've seen online that you can ask them about talking to Hernandez, and they let you, but in my game, I did something wrong. Well, not wrong. I tried to sneak up to them, and I ended up just killing them all. Either way, you get to Hernandez and ask him to come out of the cabin where he's been holed up the whole time. He tells you to holster your weapon. You do. He emerges. You ask about Calloway. He says, yeah, here's your message. Duel begins, and you kill him.
I just want to talk. My boy Calloway?
Sure. Here's your message.
There's no chase. There's no shit shoveling. And although I haven't gotten to Black Belle yet, there's no sequence where you fight off an entire army of bounty hunters. He draws on you, you draw on him, he tries to jump out of the way, you shoot him, he dies, the end. Bye-bye. See you later. So why is that? Well, I hate to be that guy, but I think one possible explanation is sort of racism by omission. Whoa. Don't click away yet. Let me explain. It is the same reason that you can make a claim that a show that doesn't feature any characters of color is racist. It may not be overt in its racism, meaning it may not say or espouse racist ideas about the superiority or inferiority of one race over another. However, the legacy of racism, especially in America and the Western world, is systemic, meaning that it is built into our subconscious, especially, but not exclusively, if you're white. It is built in that the stories of white people are more important than the stories of people of color. Therefore, it is not in what the game says about Flaco Hernandez, but rather what it does not say about him. The fact that Hernandez gets no story when Midnight, Granger, and Black Belle, who are all white, do, could be less a problem with the game story itself and more a problem with the writers deciding that they needed to cut down on the length of this side mission and settling on making Hernandez as the quickest one to get through. This kind of sucks because sometimes the game is actually pretty accidentally woke. The scene where Arthur and Lenny ride together in Lemoyne, and Lenny tells Arthur that Arthur wouldn't be able to feel the racism that Lenny is feeling in Lemoyne because he isn't black. That part rules. Or the fact that every time you shoot a racist in this game, from Klansman to Jeremiah Compson, you gain honor points for Arthur. Hell yeah, brother, I'm there. However, I can't help but point out some holes. While Lenny has some important scenes with Arthur which highlight the significance of racism at the time, Javier, a main character of the first game, is pretty notably absent from the game story. Until maybe the end when he sides with Dutch for some reason. This is especially interesting because he is one of the main characters John must hunt down in the first game. Javier has a few moments here and there, but nothing that really makes him stand out in the way that Lenny or someone like Sean does. Sean, a white Irish character, is introduced and killed in this game, and yet he is far more memorable than Javier, which once again adds up to the possibility that this game is missing the mark when it comes to Hispanic characters. Returning, however, to our main idea, legacy, we can see that Hernandez, arguably the most fearsome of all the shooters Arthur must encounter, is killed and left in the snow to presumably be eaten by some predator. Once again, this highlights what the game wants us to think about legacy. Hernandez is a well-respected and rightly feared individual who dies kinda just like Granger and Midnight, which is to say that while he remains the only one of the three men to live up to the outlaw status, he dies just like the other two. More interestingly, depending on how you approach the camp, you can see that his men don't try to get revenge on Arthur after he kills him. Instead, they just run away. For all his status as a ruthless killer and gang leader, his gang shows him next to no loyalty, unlike our man Dutch Vanderland, who the gang members will all go to the mat for until the end. Before moving on, I want to point out that the reading of this section of the game is racist does not make me like it less or make my analysis less interesting or precise. Instead, it actually adds a layer to an otherwise complicated point. And it is an attempt to answer a question using realistic cultural information. The writers of this game worked hard to include morality in the form of anti-racism and succeeded in a lot of ways that I pointed out a second ago. But this part doesn't hold up in the same way. Not because they intended to be racist. I actually don't think that. Instead, I think it's because, as someone who has studied critical race theory, omitting anything interesting for Hernandez while giving the other three white gunslingers something of a story does indicate a kind of subconscious bias. A racism by omission, like I said before. This is called doing critical analysis. Pointing out that something is missing the mark does not mean you are condemning it, nor does it mean we are, quote-unquote, canceling it. Just that we're using a certain lens to read a story. In this one, I'm using critical race theory to understand the way the writers may have been thinking or actually not thinking. That's kind of the point I'm trying to make, is that if we believe that racism is systemic, which we do, this is anybody who studies race seriously will tell you that racism is systemic to the American system, you can think that these writers may have left out a story for Hernandez not because they were like, oh, fuck the Hispanic guy, but instead because they were like, oh, okay, we gotta cut this a little bit. Let's just not do that for him. Or they didn't feel like it. They were just like, oh, it wasn't important. The ride up to the to find Hernandez is enough. And maybe it is, but I want to make it clear here that what sucks is not the writers for doing it. What sucks, a little bit, I guess, but what sucks is that they had the potential to make Hernandez really interesting, and they didn't. Moving on. When Arthur finds Black Belle, she's living in a shack in the swamps of Lemoyne and hiding out from the law. In fact, she almost blows Arthur's head off, mistaking him for a bounty hunter, as he climbs the stairs to her door. Like with all the others, Arthur asks Belle to tell him about her Wild West days. But before Arthur can explain that he's asking her because of a book about Jim Boy Calloway, the pair are interrupted by the bounty hunters that have seemingly followed Arthur to her. How he accidentally brings bounty hunters and how they know he's going to find Black Belle is not that clear. Maybe she's just saying that, whatever. Regardless, the bounty hunters come looking for her, and Arthur is recruited to fight alongside Black Belle to repel them. Black Belle tells us the entire place is wired to blow, and once a bounty hunter gets too close, she tells Arthur to pull the lever.
Now.
Then the fight begins. An entire army is brought out to kill Black Belle, and Arthur and her put down all of them. The bounty hunters even bring a Gatling gun. And after the two fight off basically all of Lemoyne, Arthur can finally ask about Jim Boy Calloway. And Black Belle suns him.
So, you gonna tell me about your Wild West days? Running with Jim Boy Calloway?
Little boy Calloway? The only running he did was away from a fight. And that's about the end of it.
By now in the video you will see the pattern. By all accounts, Calloway was not as fearsome as he claimed. Each of the gunslingers has shit on Calloway in their own ways. Black Belle most significantly. especially because of the fact that she is the only one of the gunslingers that, for one, survives, but she is also the only one we see hold her own. Granger and Midnight are both killed by Arthur after we see how pathetic they are, and Hernandez doesn't really say anything before being shot by Arthur, and so Black Belle not only survives her encounter with Arthur, but kills multiple bounty hunters before taking a picture for Arthur and riding off into the sunset. She is unlike the others in that she is competent and still running from the law, unlike Granger
I even killed rocks.
and Midnight. Oh, and she's a woman. The Western gunslinger is a man, through and through. When you pick up a Western novel or pop on your favorite Western movie, the main character is going to be a white guy. That's just how the genre goes. Yes, I know, Django Unchained exists. Yes, I know, they made that show godless. I get it. But the vast majority of these stories feature white dudes. Like I said at the beginning, there is a reason John Wayne is the most important Western actor of all time. He embodied the most important part of the genre. He was a stern-talking, hard-living, unfeeling, white guy with a gun. But was that the truth of that time? No. The truth of the Western has been significantly shaped by fictional tropes throughout the history of the United States. In fact, the first cowboys, aka gunslingers, were indigenous peoples in what is now Mexico and the southwestern United States. In fact, I just want to take a moment here. Owen Wister, who wrote The Virginian and who kind of created the trope of the gunslinger accidentally, because the Virginian in The Virginian is not a gunslinger, right? Like he can do it, but that's not his like primary thing. He's just like a good guy on the plains, on the frontier. The truth, though, is that Owen Wister was writing letters at the time to somebody whose name I forgot, and he writes something about how, like, well, real cowboys are Mexicans. So he knew this. This guy, Owen Wister, knew this, that, like, the main guy who is on the western frontier is not a white guy, though they're there, don't get me wrong, but it's indigenous people. It's people indigenous to that area who lived that lifestyle before white people came. And so white people obviously could do it. That's not to say they you know, it's too simple to be like, oh, well, then they just whitewashed it and white people never actually did that. No, there were white gunslingers, don't get me wrong, but it's the prototype, the archetype is a Mexican guy, right? But to get back to Black Belle and the place of women on the frontier, the truth is that women played a much bigger role on the frontier than damsels in distress who needed to be saved, and also sometimes slapped around by the strong white cowboy, which is actually featured quite a lot in Westerns in a way that you wouldn't expect. Women often ran homesteads, farms, whole towns, while also doing the domestic work of raising children and keeping the household running smoothly. So not only did women have to participate in all kind of, maybe not all, but most of the things that men did, right? They had to work on farms, they had to work with livestock, they had to do the work that was required of them to keep a homestead running in a way that was like useful, but then they also had to give birth to and raise children. So the truth is, though, that there was no time on the frontier for like super strict gender roles. Of course, there were gender roles because there kind of always have been gender roles in the United States, especially as the suffragette movement starts, which becomes a huge part of the way we think about gender roles today. But everyone needed to pitch in to ensure survival on the frontier. So the truth of history and the truth of the stories we tell about that history is something being critiqued here through the lens of gender. This is another way that Red Dead Redemption 2 messes up the legacy of the Western. The most impressive gunslinger of the group Arthur is tasked with tracking down is a woman. This point, though, I think, is larger than just a gunslinger who is a woman. The game wants us to realize the history of the Western is not quite what it seems. The woman is the only one who Arthur respects and who continues her life as an outlaw after the two part ways. In fact, this is also true of Sadie Adler, now that I think about it. Also, Black Belle is the only character I have ever seen, and please tell me if I'm wrong, who gets mentioned by other characters in the game, aside from Levin, obviously. There's a random rare encounter that I only got actually in this playthrough, where you can encounter a woman around a random campfire who talks about the exploits and accomplishments of Black Belle. She literally has a legacy. She is a legend. And she is a legend while being on the grounds of gender the least likely to be one. She's not supposed to be a legend in this world, but she is anyway. But it's bigger than that. Jim Boy Calloway is a liar and a drunk and kind of an idiot. But the good news for him is that Levin is trying to tell a story about one of the last gunslingers of all time. So when Arthur comes back and tells Levin about how he ended up having to kill most of the people he was tasked with getting quotes from, Levin responds,
Do you think anyone would mind if we said he'd done it? Boy Calloway.
Arthur responds by saying, sure, I don't care. We can already see the idea of legacy coming undone here. Calloway is going to get credit for killing these outlaws, and Arthur doesn't care. After drunkenly yelling about being a legend, Arthur suggests that maybe he needs to prove it to himself one more time that he truly is what he says he is. And this is where Slim Grant comes into play.
I'm gonna kill them both here!
Yeah, calm down.
I'm a legend!
Yes, you are.
All right, well, let's prove it one more time.
I don't have to prove nothing to you, nobody.
No, of course you don't, but maybe you need to prove something to you.
Long story short, Arthur tracks down Grant, takes him to see Calloway, and after Grant accuses Calloway of running from a fight 20 years ago, he turns to walk away. Calloway, feeling angry and disrespected, shoots Slim Grant in the back. The ultimate dishonor.
God damn you!
In the classic Western, two men settle their differences with a duel. You have to look the man in the eyes as you shoot him, drawing first before the other man clears leather. This trope is a staple of the Westerns, and it is one of the most significant ways for a Western character to build their legacy. A gunslinger is only as good as the notches on his pistol. Shout out to Texas Red. Calloway seems to react to this ultimate dishonor when he says, I shot him in the back. I shot him in the goddamn back. Arthur, though, responds by saying, these things happen. Calloway, shockingly, does not have the emotional intelligence to take responsibility and instead challenges Arthur. The player, as Arthur, blows Calloway's head off, obviously. But here's where things get interesting. Arthur apologizes for shooting Calloway, and Levin says,
No, and you didn't shoot him. He did. In the back, after he mortally wounded Slim Grant.
This, I think, is where we can really see the game saying something really interesting about the Western and the way it handles the ideas of legacy or being a legendary figure. And it's talking about the Western, but I think also it's making a point about American history and American storytelling more broadly. When Arthur first meets Levin, Arthur tells him, you're starting to understand something very important. The joys of gunslinging. It's win-win. Freedom or glory. Levin, struck by this, asks, I'm going to write that down, if I may. What's your name? Arthur responds, I don't have a name. What this means is that the man who actually accomplishes all of the deeds that will be attributed to Jim Boy Calloway won't even have his name recorded in the book about those accomplishments. It seems that it is very possible that one may become legendary, have a legacy that looms large over a culture for years, without having done any of the things they are legendary for. Arthur's refusal to give his name suggests that some of the deadliest gunslingers in the history of the Western frontier may remain unknown to us even now. The player can see this when Levin states, but you are a gunslinger, to which Arthur responds, not really. I mean, Folks that need shooting, I try shooting in the back. All that other stuff, well, it's bunk. This is at direct odds with Calloway, who goes crazy because he commits the sin of killing someone dishonorably. The honor of fighting face to face, usually present in the Western, means nothing to Arthur, and it's likely that Arthur thinks this way because he understands deeply the danger of a gunfight. Arthur thinks of dueling as a stupid and very easy way to get killed, though that doesn't stop him from doing it. Shooting someone in the back, however, ensures you live. Still, Arthur never tells Levin his name, and he not only kills almost all of the gunslingers that he has to interact with, but he kills Calloway too, and does so in a gunfight. Yet, Calloway is the one who will be immortalized by Levin's book. Arthur proves to be the deadliest gunslinger in the game, yet his name will not appear. Levin doesn't even know it. One of the last things Arthur says to Levin is,
Last of the gunslingers.
Well, more or less, I guess.
There's more?
Oh, there's always folk who shoot you in the back and then rewrite history.
and this, while still about legacy, really makes a point about the nature of history and the stories that have been told throughout time. In the world of Red Dead Redemption, it is entirely possible that some screenwriter, 60 years after Arthur Morgan killed everyone on Levin's list and is himself dead, will find this old book about a gunslinger named Jim Boy Calloway and turn it into a movie. In that movie, a legendary American actor like John Wayne or Clint Eastwood will portray a version of a man that didn't exist, while the one who did actually do what this book claims lies buried on a hilltop without a name. A saying everyone knows is, history is written by the victors. Usually, that is invoked to point out why we must be cautious to trust history outright. While this is true, it may be even easier to point out the problem with history is that it is written. The person holding the pen writes into that history all of the things they believe, what they think and feel about the issues they are dealing with at the time, and in many cases, what will benefit them most. Calloway's story sold, thus making Levin money, and so that's the story Levin told. Arthur didn't want to be known, so he kept his name out of the history books. Both benefited from the deal. Arthur got paid, and Levin got to sell his book. In the process, though, the world loses the truth. And I think that is what Red Dead Redemption 2 has to say about legacy and the Western. If you've gotten all the way to the end of this video, I truly, I truly appreciate it. This is something new for me. And this video was me trying to figure out how to do it. It's got its flaws, but I would genuinely be so appreciative if you could, like and subscribe, leave a comment, and share the video with friends. If you like it, I'm very grateful. If you didn't like it, let me know why. And if you liked parts but didn't like others, tell me about that too. Like I said, I'm genuinely really grateful, and I want to keep doing this, and I have a lot more ideas planned. I have a really great idea, really great essay written about The Last of Us 2 that I want to put out as soon as possible. So the more support you can give me, the better for me to be able to make this video. I think it's a really good idea. It's not brand new, but it is. It's a good take, and it's a good essay, and I've been wanting to talk about The Last of Us 2 for so long. But if you can support me on Patreon, or if you can support me here simply by just liking and subscribing, turning on the notifications, and leaving a comment and sharing it. Share it on social media and share it with a friend and whatever. That would be awesome. Yeah. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.